Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to finish the series on the Catalan opening with the closed Catalan, and we are going to be looking at everything black can do basically, because we are preparing this for the white side, but we are also going to be covering white's options, and I'm going to be recommending some, so I'll try to make this video good enough to prepare you for both sides. To make it easier to navigate the video, you can find the chapters of the video below, and if you're a patron of mine, you can also find the full PGN with all the analysis and comments on your feed, so try to follow along while watching the video. Okay, let's start. So far we've been covering the Open Catalans, and we've also been through some sidelines, and basically positions we were focusing on were positions after d takes c4 on move 4 for black. So let's get into the opening. So after d4, knight f6, other move orders are possible. This is just the most popular. If you haven't seen the introductory video on the Catalan, you can, it will explain everything. And now after d5, white plays the move g3, preparing to fianchetto his bishop, and now black has two main options, not counting bishop b4 check, which we've covered in a separate video. It's either to take the pawn going into the Open Catalans, and very sharp lines where white has grabbed the pawn, has some material, black, but white has a lot of initiative and often manages to regain the pawn, and if black holds onto the pawn without letting go, then he can find himself in trouble. So that's one approach. The other approach is what we are covering today. Bishop to e7, the closed Catalan. Black simply says, I don't want your pawn, I'm going to develop my king side first, then I'm going to develop my queen side, and I'll just make my pieces good. I will not have any weaknesses, and I'm going to close your Catalan bishop down. So the two main ideas of the closed Catalan: firstly, not get mated, not get in trouble by taking material. Secondly, blunt the Catalan bishop. In the closed Catalan, black is going to have a pawn structure with a pawn on c6 most often, and this semi-Slav pawn triangle means two things. The first thing is black's position will be very hard to open up and to crack, meaning white will definitely not have a quick attack, and white will definitely not be winning in 20 moves, as is often the case in the Open Catalan. The second thing behind the semi-Slav pawn structure, which we get in the closed Catalan, is the bad c8 bishop. So, as we know, in the semi-Slav, black's main idea is to play c5 to free up that bishop and to put it on b7. The other idea could be to play e5, as is seen in some lines. In the closed Catalan, the plan is usually going to involve b6 and either bishop b7 followed by c5 or bishop a6, as we are going to see in some lines. So, two main things: blunt the g2 bishop, create a solid pawn structure which is hard to break open, and you have trouble with the c8 bishop. So those are some of the main themes in the closed Catalan. Now the main pawn breaks, before we continue, for black, as we said, is going to be c5 very often. And if you don't play c5, then usually your bishop is bad, your position is cramped, you're not fighting for the center. For white, as is the case in the semi-Slav as well, and in the Nimzo Indian, the Queen's Indian, most light squared openings for white with the bishop on g2 or knight on c3, so most d4 openings, white wants to play e4. So let's just have a brief look at this pawn structure. So if we imagine that in the starting position, black has played c6 and then b6 to free up his bishop, meaning his pieces are developed. White has played b3 and bishop to b2 and knight d2, for example. And the main pawn breaks are achieved here. This is a position we are going to see in some lines. This is very common. One thing you have to remember is when black plays c5, white's usual response should be e4. When white plays e4, black's usual response should be c5. When white plays e4 and black plays c5, white should usually exchange on d5. So e takes d5 and e takes d5. And this is the pawn structure we're going to get. It's either going to be symmetrical, like this, or some more central pawns are going to get traded off. But basically, that's what both sides are trying to achieve. This is a very common pawn structure. Basically, black is going to be playing with the Queen's Indian pawn structure after a while, or trying to achieve it, and white will play a Catalan. I know this may sound confusing. Let's get back here. So by playing this move bishop to e7, black is accepting a very complex positional struggle, and to play the closed Catalan, you have to know a lot of ideas in a lot of different openings, which is what makes it a very popular weapon on the highest levels, and what also makes it rather unpopular on lower levels. It's complex, and you have to know a lot of stuff. So bishop e7 prepares to create a semi-Slav pawn structure, and eventually, in most lines, you want to expand into a huge Queen's Indian pawn center with b6, c5, d5, e6, and with your bishop outside of the pawn chain. And then you want to trade off stuff in the center and equalize. It's not a fighting opening, which will give you an advantage in most lines, but it's very hard to break it. All right, now let's continue. White plays bishop to g2, both sides castle. That's the main line. One thing I would like to mention, which I wouldn't recommend, is playing queen to c2. A queen to c2 may seem like a logical move, going for an advantage before castling, preparing the move e4, preparing to open the center, also defending this pawn. But after queen to c2, c5 is extremely annoying because d4 is weak. And now you have two options. You can either castle, which is the best move, and after cd, knight d. Let me show you that. Obviously, black has managed to trade his c-pawn for the d-pawn. And for example, knight c6, knight c6, b6, this is very good for black. And black is slightly better. This is sort of a Grunfeld in reverse, in which black has no issues at all. It's just a very good position. And after c5, if you play d takes c5, then queen a5 check, and knight c3, dc4, again, quite good for black. Again, no issues, and I mean, white has nothing here. So queen c2 is not such a good move. It's not horrible, it's not unplayable, but it's way inferior to the main line. So against the closed Catalan, so bishop e7, you just play the two most sensible moves, bishop g2, and then you castle. Now we come to the main branching of the position. Okay, the move d takes c4, we are going to cover separately in the next chapter of this video, and it's important to know it, but it's not the closed Catalan. That's not the closed Catalan. I still have to mention it because there are some separate lines to the Open Catalan, but this basically leads to positions very similar to the Open Catalan and sometimes transposes. Okay, three more options that we have to mention are the three transpositions black could go for. The first one is c5, which leads to the Tarrasch in the Queen's Gambit declined. Watch the video on the Tarrasch. For this, I'm not going to go into details here. So c5 goes into the Tarrasch, b6 goes into the Queen's Indian, a clean Queen's Indian. Again, watch the series on the Queen's Indian for that. And the move knight e4 actually transposes to the Stonewall Dutch after f5 and c6. So watch the video on the Stonewall Dutch for that. So as you can see, there are quite a lot of options which are at black's disposal. So if you play the Catalan, you basically have to know Queen's Indians, you have to know semi-Slavs, you have to know the Tarrasch, you have to know the Stonewall, you have to know the Open and the Closed Catalan, but that's why the Catalan is a full repertoire for white. So just remember, this goes into Open Catalan resembling positions, we are going to cover it, b6 Queen's Indian, c5 Tarrasch, knight e4, Stonewall. And the two moves that are actually closed Catalans are c6 and knight b to d7, and these moves we are going to be focusing on. Knight b to d7 is slightly less common, but in most cases it will transpose to the main line with c6. We are going to get to that, and pawn to c6 is just the main line. Okay, now before we get to c6, let's cover d takes c4 first. Okay, so we are on move 6 and black takes d takes c4. Now, this is Open Catalan fashion. It can transpose to bishop e7 Open Catalans, it can transpose to a6 Open Catalans, it could transpose to many Open Catalans, but there are some move orders which are unique. So our response to this is going to be queen c2, preparing to grab the pawn. Now, I'm going to show you all sensible options for black. We are going to cover them briefly. And I'll just show you a quick way to play against each. Firstly, b5 has to be mentioned, doesn't work. Defending the pawn is impossible because of a4. And now a6 loses a pawn because of pawn takes, you cannot recapture. c6 runs into knight e5, again you lose material. So the only way to hold the position is b4. But now the nice move knight f to d2 and attacking the pawn, attacking the rook, basically c6 is forced, and after knight takes e4, white stands much better. So remember that b5 is not an option. b6 is a weird move, it's not too bad, but after bishop g5, knight d5, white should stand slightly better, the bishops get traded off. You take back your c4 pawn, there's a weakness on c7, it's not easy to play c5 because you'll have an isolated c pawn. For example, bishop a6 and queen c2, and white should be slightly better. Okay, then c6, which is normal Open Catalan fashion, just grab your pawn back, and after b5 you can play queen c2, and this we've seen in several videos on the Open Catalan. So this is really no problem at all. It's just you have to know the Open Catalan as well. Bishop b7, rook d1, knight b to d7, knight c3, queen b6, for example. We've seen this before, e4, c5, etc., etc. So black basically wants to liquidate the center, make the pawn structure almost symmetrical and make his bishops good. So if you take here, for example, then bishop takes, and the Catalan bishops for black work well. Okay, another option is c5, which again resembles the c5 Open Catalans. After queen takes c4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, something like e5 and knight b3. Again, no problems for white. White's bishop is much better than black's bishops, and the pawn structure is symmetrical, so it's not a big advantage, but it's an advantage. And the main move is pawn to a6, which resembles the main lines of the Open Catalan with pawn to a6. And against this, you simply continue a4, you prevent b5, bishop to d7, preparing bishop c6. So this is going to be a combination of the bishop e7, bishop d7, and a6 Open Catalans. So again, please watch videos on all three. I know the Catalan is complex and there's a ton of stuff, but there's nothing I can do about it. Queen takes pawn, bishop c6, and now bishop g5. And again, white holds a slight edge and should have no issues. Bishop d5, this is a forced line in which the queen gets pushed around, bishop e4. And we've seen this before, queen c1 and h6 and bishop f6 and bishop f6 and rook d1. This should be familiar to you. And again, after something like a5 and knight bd2, white should be slightly better. Bishop f3, you cannot take this pawn because of knight e4, and this is hanging, and the queen is attacked. So something like c6 should be played, and knight c4, and white is slightly better. So this is a complex position which you have to study on your own after d takes c4, but it's not the Closed Catalan, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. Just remember that basically a6 is the only good move for black after queen c2, and you respond to it with a4, you prevent b5, and then you grab your pawn back. Black gives back the pawn, and usually in Open Catalan-like positions, if white gets the pawn back, then he should be better, and that's the case here. Okay, now let's continue with c6. That is going to be our main move and the main line, and that's what we should be focusing on. So after pawn to c6, we already know what black is trying to do. Black is trying to create a solid semi-Slav pawn structure. Black is later on trying to play b6, c5 and free up his position. He will have issues with this bishop, as we will see, it can either go to b7 or a6. This knight can either go to d7 or to a6, which supports c5. So these are going to be the differences. This is going to be the same. Okay, so this is always the same. Castles, bishop e7, knight f6, c6. And the difference is going to be either b6 and bishop b7, or b6 and bishop a6, or b6 and knight bd7, or b6 knight a6. And playing for c5 is always the same. White's response, even though there are other moves, you can play b3, knight c3, knight bd2, queen b3, bishop f4, there are many sidelines. You should play the best move, which is queen c2. That supports e4, prepares rook d1, defends this pawn in case black decides to take it all of a sudden, and basically puts the queen on the best possible square on the board. Now, two options for black, as we are going to see. c6 and knight bd7 is one of them, which we're going to have a look at now, and c6, b6 is the main line. Let's look at knight bd7. Well, knight bd7 usually will include playing the move b6 as well, but if you play b6 first, often the knight will go to a6, or most commonly the knight will go to a6. So basically here black has to decide what to do, whether he will play for knight a6 and c5 or knight bd7 and c5 later on. So if we start with knight bd7, white should play b3. Again, there are other moves, there are other possibilities. Knight bd2 is the most common move. Usually b3 is played there as well, but b3 is, in my opinion, the best move, and according to my preparation and the books I've read, b3 is the easiest to play. So you basically prepare to develop your bishop, and very sensible move. Okay, b6, and now we play rook d1. And now you can see if any exchanges happen in the center, your rook is lined up with the queen, and it's a useful move. Now, as we said, there are two options, develop the bishop to b7 or to a6. Let's have a look at both. If bishop b7, then white continues knight c3, and rook c8, preparing to, well, do the same thing white has done. And now we come to the most common pawn breaks, e4. In this position, c5 isn't really a good move, because white would have time for e5. So you take, d takes e4, and knight takes e4. And after this trade happens, knight e, queen e, now we can see a thematic pawn structure here. And after this trade, it should be easier to play both sides. And the position becomes much clearer. And this is going to be a common pawn structure. Black, of course, continues knight f6. This is common in the Caro-Kann, in the Semislav, in the London system, this trade on e4. And after knight f6, the queen drops back to e2. Queen c7, bishop f4, attacks the queen, bishop d6. And here you can trade, you can play knight e5. In any case, what black is trying to do, after either white accepts the trade or plays knight e5, at some point black wants to play c5. And same as in the Semislav, this queen either belongs on c7 or on b6. In the Semislav, usually b6, but here b6 is occupied. So the queen supports the bishop, gets away from the rook on d1, and basically initiates a useful trade. So if black can break with c5 or with e5, the position should be equal. Especially if these two bishops are traded off, then black can sometimes be better in an endgame because white has made light squared weaknesses. So that's bishop b7. If bishop a6, then white should continue with knight b to d2, adding some more support to c4 and preparing e4. And after rook c8, again, you continue with e4. And now there are two options. You can play c5. You can play d takes e4. I think d takes e4 is, again, just sensible for black. However, if black does play c5, you now have two options. You can play e5 or e takes d5. E takes d5 is more popular, but e5 is very interesting because black is most probably going to end up with an isolated pawn if you manage to move your queen, and the knight is quite awkwardly placed. I mean, knight e8 is basically the only option, and now c takes d, and after e takes d, queen e4, now you can see that This is a very strong center if we are given a move. For example, if black plays a stupid move. Let's find a stupid move. Okay, let's say rook c3. Then here, and already you can see that there's huge trouble. So black plays bishop to b7 to prevent this, and simply queen takes d4. So this I don't think is pleasant for black. It's not losing, but the problem is all the pieces are sort of stuck. I mean, the back rank is very crowded. It's very hard to move any of the pieces. So yeah, I would not recommend this for black. Instead of that, after e4, black should simply take the pawn. D takes e4, and that's just similar to what we saw, but the bishop is not on b7. So knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4. Now it's possible to play knight f6 again, chase the queen away, but more common is b5. This has been played a few times, and after b5 the queen should drop back, and again black wants to trade off pieces, trade off pawns in the center somehow, and get a symmetrical pawn structure. So those are independent knight b7 lines in which let's go through that again. After knight bd7, in which black has committed the knight already, so we are basically making it easier for white to play this position. As white, we already know that the knight either goes to a6 or d7. So if the knight commits first before b6, then it's easier to play. We know that we can immediately stop thinking about knight a6 and c5, the other move order we are going to have a look at now. So let's go through this again. Knight bd7, you play b3, black plays b6, you play rook d1, very natural move. Now bishop b7 or bishop a6 are possible. What you have to remember is that against bishop b7 you play knight c3, because c4 doesn't need defending, and against bishop a6 you play knight b to d2, supporting e4 and supporting c4 to avoid any tricks. And after you develop your knight, you play for e4. Now black should take it, initiate the trades. If he doesn't, play e5, and that's very, very simple. So let's have a look at it. Bishop b7, so knight c3, because the bishop is not on a6. He plays rook c8, we play e4, and if c5, then e5. So that's what we know. If d takes e4, the knight takes, queen takes. Here the queen either goes to c2 or to e2. I don't think it makes a big difference. When the bishop is on a6, then we definitely go to c2 to not get pinned. When the bishop is on b7, queen e2 is better to prevent e5 and control e4. Okay, now let's get on to the main lines. After queen c2, black's least committal and black's best move is to play b6. And now you again have the option of playing knight d7, of course, if you want to. Or you can play knight a6, as we're going to see. So here you can play b3 again. You can play knight bd2, you can play rook d1, you can play bishop f4, you can even play knight e5. But I would recommend the move knight b to d2. That's the main theoretical move. So against knight bd7 you play b3. Against b6 you play knight bd2. If black plays a non-committal move, then we should play a non-committal move too. Now this move is good. Still, we are prepared to meet bishop a6 because we've defended c4. We are prepared to meet bishop to b7 and knight bd7 because our knight is on d2. We are okay with that, and we are preparing e4. We can always play b3 later if the position transposes, so no problem there. And we basically haven't committed. And it's a more useful move than b3. Against knight bd7, we are waiting to see where the bishop goes, so we play b3 first. Okay, here black plays either bishop b7 or bishop a6. Bishop a6 is very rare transposing, so now we just play our b3 and knight bd7, and we are in the position we saw previously. So if by any chance black should play bishop a6, we play b3 transposing. If he plays bishop b7 though, which is the main move, now of course he still has the option to play knight bd7 at some point, but much more common is going to be to play knight a6. we continue with e4. It's prepared enough. We have the knight on d2, we have the queen. Our d4 pawn is defended, our bishop is ready, and everything is perfect. In this position, knight a6 should be played by black. And here, you can play a3, which is the main move. You can also play e5, but I wouldn't recommend e5. If you go e5, then it's not about knight to b4. Knight b4 is a nothing move. It's about knight d7, because as you can see in the previous position, give me a second. Okay, let's say here after c5, when we played e5 here, the knight didn't have a retreat square, because this knight was developed to d7. When the knight goes to a6, then the f6 knight has a retreat square. So let's go back to this position. After knight a6, we don't really want to play e5, because this position can be easily undermined. So for example, e5, knight d7. And now you can see that as soon as black plays either c5 or f6, this is very similar to the French defense now. Let's give white a move. Let's play a3 here. Well, I can immediately play a6. I can also play c5, and your center is just collapsing. What do you do if you take? I mean, this is just a bad position. Black has these hanging pawns, but they're great hanging pawns. They're controlling the entire board. This pawn is weak. I mean, white's position collapses. So against knight a6, e5 is a playable move. I'm not saying it's not a playable move. If you like playing against the French, and if you like defending your broad center, then okay. But a3 is just calmer. Don't give up your center for nothing. And against a3, the main move is c5. Now, because our pawn is still on e4, we can gain an edge in the center. We haven't committed with e5. And of course, the idea behind knight a6, as we already said, is to support c5. But now, since our pawn is still on e4, we have the flexibility to take. And now e takes d5. And as we saw in this structure, when e4 is played and c5 is played, usually white should take on d5. That's what I was talking about a while back. So a3, c5, we take on d5. A trade on d5 happens. So e takes d5. We have this symmetrical pawn structure. And now there are a couple of options for white. White can choose between a few things. You can play rook d1. You can play cd5, which isn't really such a good move. You can also continue with weird stuff like knight h4, trying to open up your bishop. But by far, the best move is simply d takes c5. And with d takes c5, you are, well, going to get a slight edge whatever happens. If pawn takes, then black has an isolated pawn, and that's not so good. If bishop takes, then the knight is stranded for no good reason. Why did you play knight a6? Are you going to play knight c7 now? You don't have the b4 square. So basically knight takes is forced, and that justifies knight a6. But now this runs into b4. And after b4, the knight goes back to e6. Now you continue bishop b2. And this is a very good position for white. Of course, this can still be traded off. Black doesn't have to be left with an isolated pawn. So after something like rook c8 and knight e5, the position gets complex. But look at these two bishops. I mean, this is just tactically more pleasing for white. I'm not saying it's much better for white, but it's easier for black to make a mistake. Okay, queen c7 attacks the knight, so if the bishop for some reason moves, the knight is loose. Rook a c1 supports the c file, and now you can see how many defenders we have on c4. Now finally d takes c4. The queen on c7 also defends the bishop, so no tricks. And now a mass exchange. Unfortunately, queen takes, knight d takes, or knight e takes is possible. I think knight d takes is better. It's the main move. You want to keep this beautiful knight. And also the knight on d2 isn't really that good. So knight d takes. And now bishop g2, king g2, and rook c7. Black prepares to double. This should be perfectly equal. It's 2 against 2 on the queen side, 3 against 3 on the king side. 2 knights, bishop each. White's pieces are more active. The knights are more active. but it should be equal. So yeah, I don't think there should be any issues for black whatsoever, but white should be slightly better. Okay, let's go over that once more. Okay, so bishop e7, the closed Catalan, bishop g2, castles, c6 the main move, queen c2, and now b6 the main move. And after knight b to d2, if bishop a6, then we transpose with b3, knight bd7. If bishop b7, then play e4 straight away. Black plays knight a6, and now not e5, because the knight has a retreat square, although it is possible, but a3. Black should break with c5, and now this exchange, which you have to remember, ed, ed, dc, knight c, and b4. This is the key idea, and white should have a slight edge. Okay, now let's have a brief look at the move knight bd7 on move 6. This, as we said, is a sideline instead of c6. The only reason I'd like to show you this move is because of a gambit line white could choose to play, which I'm not a big fan of, I wouldn't recommend, but I'm going to mention it. Firstly, if you play queen c2, then c6 transposes to the main line, and now b3, we have the knight bd7 thing, or it's just the same thing. Here we play rook to d1, black can play here or here, and we know this already. However, white has an option here, which he doesn't really have after c6, and that's to play knight c3, and basically challenging this structure straight away and preparing to play e4, queen c2, and push black back. And the only way to justify playing knight bd7 for black is to take the pawn, have nothing better, and this is called the gambit line. Okay, so black takes, and we are sort of in the open Catalan again. White manages to play e4, black now plays c6, trying to play b5, and bishop f4, and rook e8, and a4, and b6 is the main line. And after queen e2, there have been a lot of games played from this position. I think about 30 or 40 games with bishop a6, where black sort of manages to hold on to the pawn, but white should be slightly better. I think there's a lot of compensation with this central control, and basically all of white's pieces are perfect. All of white's pieces are doing what they should be doing, something like queen e7 and d5 and knight d5 and bishop d2, and it's going to be easy to launch a kingside attack. So if you want to play aggressively against the closed Catalan, if black plays knight b to d7, you have the option to play this move knight c3. So you can do that if you want to. Okay, let's just repeat everything. So if black plays bishop e7, this is the closed Catalan. We continue bishop to g2, and after castles we don't play queen c2, which should be slightly better. We play castles. Okay, now after castles, black has the option to play b6 going into the queen's Indian, c5 going into the Tarash, knight e4 going into the stone wall. The main move is c6. The main alternative is knight bd7, and he can also play dc4 going into semi-open Catalan lines. Sorry if this was too much. I hope you got something from the video, and let me know what you think. I mean, I hope this helps. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.